September 2021. The fall air smelled like pine trees and red clay in the faraway hills of McCurtain County, Oklahoma. A plain SUV with no markings stopped outside an old farmhouse on County Road 47, 30 miles from the nearest town. Inside, 68-year-old Pastor Gerald Matthews was working on his Sunday church speech at the kitchen table. He did this same thing every Saturday evening for the past 27 years as the love minister of Broken Bow First Baptist Church. Someone knocked on the door at 6:47 p.m. The knock was serious and official. Reverend Matthews, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant to arrest you for the 1991 disappearance and murder of Michelle Lawrence. The officers would later say that the old pastor's hands kept moving across his notes, like he was finishing one last thought before putting down his pen. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. I wondered if you'd ever find her. For 30 years, the man who had helped sad families, baptized children, and talked about forgiveness had carried the darkest secret in McCurtain County history. He had searched with volunteers. He had prayed in public for Michelle's safe return. He had even led the memorial service when hope finally died. And he had never once told what he'd buried in the Ouachita National Forest on a dark night in July 1991. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. September 14th, 2021. The first light of morning came through the thick trees of pine and oak in the Ouachita National Forest. Long shadows spread across a clearing that had stayed untouched for 3 decades. A team that digs up evidence from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation had arrived at 5:47 a.m. Their white vans were parked in a careful line along an unmarked forest road 32 miles northeast of Broken Bow. The air felt heavy with wetness, the kind of thick humidity that made breathing feel like hard work. Detective Amanda Reeves stood at the edge of the roped-off area. She held a cup of gas station coffee that was getting cold in her hands. At 34, she was the youngest main investigator in the OSBI's cold case unit. And this moment was the result of 14 months of careful work that had taken over her life. The ground-reading radar had proved what the body-sniffing dogs had shown 2 weeks earlier. Something was buried here, about 6 feet down, in soil that hadn't been touched since the summer of 1991. "We're ready to begin," called out Dr. Patricia Moreno, the bone expert who had driven in from Oklahoma City the night before. Her team of 4 workers began the careful job of removing layers of forest trash, decades of piled-up leaves and branches that had hidden this spot, as well as any planned hiding. The location itself was important. This 17-acre piece of land, technically inside national forest boundaries, had been rented to the Matthews family since 1967 for what county records called fun and hunting purposes. A small hunting cabin sat empty 200 yards to the west. Its windows were broken and roof was sagging from years of nobody taking care of it. According to property records, the rental had been kept up without stopping by Gerald Matthews, even after he said he had stopped hunting in the mid-1990s because of joint pain. Reeves had found this detail buried in a box of money documents during a normal search of Matthews's home office 3 months earlier. The rental payments, small but steady, continued even as Matthews told investigators over the years that he rarely went into the forest anymore. Why keep paying for land you never use? The question had bothered Reeves until she compared the property locations with old search maps from 1991. The first search for Michelle Lawrence had come within a quarter mile of this exact spot. Volunteers had searched the public trails, but this private rental area had been written in search logs as cleared by property owner Pastor G. Matthews. No one else had checked it. No one had questioned the word of a respected man of God. 24 hours earlier, at 6:47 p.m. on September 13th, Reeves had stood on the bent wooden porch of Matthews's farmhouse, warrant in hand, watching the old man's face as the words left her mouth. "Reverend Matthews, Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant to arrest you for the 1991 disappearance and murder of Michelle Lawrence." The moment stretched impossibly long. Through the screen door, she could see Matthews sitting at his kitchen table, paper spread in front of him, reading glasses sitting on his nose. He was alone. His wife of 43 years had died in 2019, and his two grown children lived in other states. The house smelled of coffee and old wood, normal and ordinary. Matthews hadn't looked up right away. His pen kept moving across the yellow legal pad, finishing whatever sentence he'd been writing. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, Reeves saw something she hadn't expected. Not surprise, not anger, just a deep tiredness, as if he'd been carrying an impossible weight for so long that letting it go, even through arrest, brought a kind of terrible relief. "I wondered if you'd ever find her," he said quietly, setting down his pen with careful control. "I've been writing my confession. I suppose I don't need to finish it now." The words had sent a chill through Reeves that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. 30 years. 30 years of church speeches and prayers and public concern, and here was a man who had been waiting to be caught, half hoping for it, unable to confess, but unable to fully hide. Now, as Dr. Moreno's team worked carefully through layers of Oklahoma red clay, Reeves found herself thinking about Carol Lawrence. Michelle's mother was 73 now, living in the same small house on Cedar Street where she'd raised her daughter. Reeves had visited her the evening before the arrest to prepare her for what was coming. "You found her," Carol had said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Her hands had shaken as she reached for the framed photo on the shelf, the one that showed Michelle at 18 in her graduation gown and cap, smile wide and real. 30 years, 3 months, and 1 day. "I've been counting." The digging was entering its 4th hour when Dr. Moreno called out from the pit. "We have cloth pieces and bone." Her voice had the calm sound that came from decades of seeing human remains. But Reeves could hear the note of success underneath. Every cold case investigator lived for this moment, the instant when theory became evidence, when the missing became the found. Reeves climbed down the temporary ladder into the digging site. The pit was perfectly square, walls perfectly straight up and down. The bottom now showed what looked like old fabric, possibly denim, wrapped around what were clearly human remains. The body had been placed curled up, hands near the face, buried without a coffin or any formal preparation. A quick burial, a panic burial. "There's something else," Dr. Moreno said, her gloved hands carefully brushing away soil from an area near what would have been the victim's chest. "A book. Looks like it was buried with her." As the soil fell away, the object became clearer. A hymnal. Its leather cover was stained and damp. Inside the front cover, visible through the clear plastic evidence bag, once it was carefully taken out, was a name written in fading blue ink: Michelle Lawrence. Reeves felt her throat tighten. This was the detail that would break the case wide open in the public's mind. Not just a body buried in the woods, but a body buried with a church hymnal by a man who had led that very church for 27 years. The meaning would be impossible to miss, the betrayal complete. The digging continued through the afternoon. Each bone was photographed in its place before removal. Each piece of evidence was written down with careful attention. By 4:30 p.m., Dr. Moreno had recovered enough of the skeleton to make a first assessment. Female, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, age matching late teens or early 20s. Cause of death would need lab testing, but visible damage to the skull suggested hard impact. Back at the McCurtain County Sheriff's Department, Gerald Matthews sat in an interview room waiting. He had asked for his right to have a lawyer, but then unexpectedly had begun talking anyway, as if a dam had finally broken after 3 decades of pressure. The video recording would later become important evidence, showing a man who seemed almost relieved to finally tell the truth. "She was special," Matthews said, his voice barely above a whisper, hands folded on the metal table. "Talented, pure. I told myself I was helping her, guiding her to develop her musical gifts. But I was lying to myself. And when she understood what was happening, when she threatened to tell people about the wrong attention, about the letters I'd written," he paused, closing his eyes. "I panicked. We argued in my office after the others had left. She said she was going to the police. I grabbed her arm to stop her from leaving, and she pulled away, and..." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. But the meaning was clear. An argument had turned into violence. A push or a hit. A young woman falling, her head hitting something solid and hard, and then the planned decision to hide what had happened, to bury the evidence and the victim in a place where no one would think to look. As darkness fell over the Ouachita National Forest, portable lights lit up the digging site, making stark shadows across the now empty grave. The remains of Michelle Lawrence were being taken to the medical examiner's office in Oklahoma City, beginning the final journey toward identification and finally justice. Detective Reeves stood alone at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the treetops that had kept this secret for so long. Somewhere in Broken Bow, Carol Lawrence was waiting for the phone call that would prove what she had always known in her heart. Somewhere in a jail cell, Gerald Matthews was beginning to understand how big his fall from grace was. And somewhere in the darkness of the Oklahoma night, the ghost of a 19-year-old girl with a beautiful voice could perhaps at last rest. Michelle Lawrence was born on March 3, 1972, at McCurtain Memorial Hospital in Idabel, Oklahoma, the only child of Carol and David Lawrence. Her arrival came after 6 years of marriage and 3 miscarriages, making her what her mother would later describe as our miracle, our answered prayer. The small house on Cedar Street, where Carol brought her daughter home, still has the same faded blue shutters it had that spring day, though the neighborhood has changed a lot in the decade since. David Lawrence worked as a boss at the Weyerhaeuser lumber mill on the edge of Broken Bow, a job he held for 32 years until the mill closed in 1998. Carol worked part-time as a seamstress, taking in fixes and mending from her dining room table, adding to the family's small income. They were working-class people in a working-class town, the kind of family where every dollar was counted and college savings began with coins in a jar. Broken Bow in the 1970s and 1980s was a town of about 4,000 people, tucked in the southeastern corner of Oklahoma, where the pine forests of the Ouachita Mountains met the red clay flatlands. The town's money came from timber, tourists from nearby Beavers Bend State Park, and the small branch campus of Southeastern Oklahoma State University. It was a place where high school football games drew half the town on Friday nights, where the 4th of July parade was the social event of the summer, and where leaving your doors unlocked wasn't foolish, but simply normal. Broken Bow was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, for better or worse. Remember Janet Morrison, who taught Michelle in 3rd grade at Broken Bow Elementary. If a child was struggling, the whole community helped. If a family had hard times, church groups organized meal trains without being asked. That's the world Michelle grew up in, where trust was the normal setting. From an early age, Michelle showed a remarkable talent for music that seemed to go beyond her simple background. Carol remembered the moment she first recognized her daughter's gift. Michelle was 4 years old, sitting in the pew at Broken Bow First Baptist Church during Sunday service, when she began singing along to a hymn she'd never been taught. Not just the tune, but in perfect pitch, her small voice clear and true. I looked at David, and he looked at me, and we both knew we were hearing something special. Carol remembered in a 2019 interview shortly before her health began getting worse. After the service, Pastor Harris, that was before Pastor Matthews' time, he pulled us aside and said, "That child has been given a gift from God. You need to help it grow." The Lawrence family couldn't afford private music lessons, but the church community stepped in. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the church piano player for 43 years, began giving Michelle free lessons twice a week in exchange for help with yard work that David provided. By age 8, Michelle was singing solos during Sunday services. By 12, she was leading the youth choir. By 16, she had won regional competitions and received scholarship offers from 3 Oklahoma universities. Michelle's high school years at Broken Bow High School painted a picture of a hardworking, somewhat shy young woman who found her confidence mainly through music. Her yearbook photo from 1990, her senior year, shows a thin girl with shoulder-length brown hair, warm hazel eyes, and a gentle smile that never quite reached the level of excitement shown by her classmates. Michelle was quiet, but not in a way that made you worry, said Robert Shun, who sat behind her in AP English. She was just thoughtful, the kind of person who'd listen more than she talked, but when she did speak, it was always worth hearing. She didn't hang out with the popular crowd, but everyone liked her. There was a kindness to her that you just don't see that often. She graduated 17th in a class of 84 students, with special strength in literature and music theory. Her college application essay, kept in university records, told her dream of becoming a music teacher so I can help other kids find their voice the way this community helped me find mine. The essay's honesty and thankfulness showed the values taught by her working-class upbringing and religious foundation. In the fall of 19, she chose to drive back and forth rather than live in the dorms, partly to save money, partly because she stayed close to her parents and felt no rush to leave. She declared a major in music education, joined the university's concert choir, and took a part-time job at the campus library, putting away books for minimum wage. Her routine during those 2 years of college was predictable and purposeful. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, she went to morning classes, worked her library shift from noon to 4, then made the drive back to Broken Bow in time for dinner. Tuesdays and Thursdays, she had afternoon labs and evening practices. Weekends were saved for church activities, family time, and studying at the small desk in her childhood bedroom. Michelle was exactly the kind of daughter every parent hopes for. David Lawrence told investigators during the first missing persons inquiry in 1991. She called if she was going to be late. She helped her mother with groceries without being asked. She saved her library paychecks for books and gas. She never gave us a moment's worry, not once. At Broken Bow First Baptist Church, Michelle had become a necessary part of the music ministry by the time she was 19. She sang in the adult choir, helped organize the children's Christmas show, and served as assistant director for the youth praise team. It was a role that brought her into regular contact with Pastor Gerald Matthews, who had joined the church as associate pastor in 1989 and been promoted to senior pastor in January 1991. Matthews, then 48 years old, had arrived in Broken Bow with impressive credentials. He held a Master of Divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, had served churches in Texas and Arkansas, and came with glowing recommendations. His sermons were described as smart yet easy to understand, and his counseling approach was praised as caring and wise. Within months, attendance had grown, and the church board considered him the best pastoral hire they'd made in decades. Michelle's interactions with Pastor Matthews began professionally and properly, or so it appeared to outside observers. He recognized her musical talent and encouraged her to consider leading worship music full-time after graduation. He offered to write recommendation letters for graduate programs. He suggested additional hymns that would show off her vocal range. But there were details that, viewed through the lens of later discoveries, took on a darker meaning. Matthews began scheduling private meetings with Michelle to discuss worship planning and spiritual development. These meetings typically happened in his office on Saturday afternoons when the church building was otherwise empty. He began giving her books from his personal library, writing in them with messages that, while not clearly wrong, suggested a level of personal investment that went beyond pastoral boundaries. A diary entry from Michelle's junior year, found by investigators in 1991 but not fully understood until decades later, contained a brief note. PM gave me another book today. Asked about my plans after graduation again. Said I have extraordinary potential and shouldn't limit myself to public school teaching. He's very encouraging, but sometimes the attention feels like too much. Don't want to seem ungrateful. The diary, a simple spiral-bound notebook with a flower cover bought at the local Walmart, would become one of the investigation's most valuable resources. Michelle wrote occasionally, sometimes going weeks without entries, but her words provided insight into a thoughtful young woman moving from being a teenager to an adult with more self-awareness than many give that age credit for. Her final semester, spring 1991, brought increasing school pressure as Michelle prepared for big exams required for her major. Her diary entry from that period talk about stress about keeping her GPA up, concern about student teaching assignments in the fall, and tiredness from balancing work, school, and church commitments. But they also contain the first hints of discomfort about her relationship with Pastor Matthews. April 17, 1991, PM asked if I'd considered staying in Broken Bow after graduation, maybe working for the church full-time. I told him I'd always planned to teach in public schools. He seemed disappointed, said something about how public education was spiritually dangerous for someone with my gifts. Felt weird. May 22, 1991, Found another note in my hymnal after choir practice. PM left it, I think. Just Bible verses about not hiding your light under a basket and answering God's call. But why leave notes instead of just talking to me? Mom says he's probably just being encouraging, but it feels different than when Pastor Hendricks used to mentor me. June 30th, 1991. PM wants to meet this Saturday to discuss something important about my future. He was very insistent. I have a weird feeling about it, but don't know why. Maybe I'm reading too much into things. He's the pastor. He's supposed to care about people's spiritual growth. That Saturday was July 6th, 1991. The meeting was mentioned again in Michelle's diary, in an entry dated July 8th that would be among her last. The meeting with PM was uncomfortable. He talked a lot about special connections and spiritual bonds that go beyond normal pastor-congregant relationships. He held my hand while praying, which he's never done before. I pulled away and said I needed to go. He apologized and said I'd misunderstood. I don't think I did. I need to talk to Mom about this, but I don't want to cause problems at church. Everyone loves him. Michelle never had that conversation with her mother. The next diary entry, dated July 12th, one day before she disappeared, simply read, "Choir practice tomorrow." Dreading it. PM scheduled another meeting after. I'm going to tell him I'm not comfortable with these private meetings anymore. I'm 19, not a child. If he has something to say about church music, he can say it during regular practices. On Saturday, July 13th, 1991, Michelle Lawrence left her house at 5:15 p.m. for what should have been a normal choir practice. She wore jeans and a white cotton shirt, carried her church hymnal and her purse, and told her parents she'd be home by 8:30 at the latest. Her mother later remembered that Michelle had seemed worried during lunch, quieter than usual, but thought it was tiredness from her library shifts. Carol Lawrence never saw her daughter alive again. July 13th, 1991. The Saturday evening choir practice at Broken Bow First Baptist Church was scheduled to begin at 6 p.m., a weekly tradition that had continued without stopping for over 2 decades. Michelle Lawrence arrived at 5:52 p.m., her blue 1984 Honda Civic pulling into the church parking lot next to 7 other vehicles belonging to fellow choir members. Security camera footage from the First National Bank across the street, reviewed during the first investigation, captured her walking toward the church's side entrance, hymnal tucked under her arm, posture slightly hunched as if bracing against an invisible weight. The practice went normally according to the 6 other people there. Michelle sang her usual soprano part, helped pass out sheet music for an upcoming service, and joined in the after-practice prayer circle led by Pastor Matthews. Nothing seemed wrong to casual observers, though choir member Patricia Simmons would later tell what happened in the next hour and 7 minutes would remain unknown for 30 years. At 8:30 p.m., Carol Lawrence glanced at the clock above the kitchen sink and felt the first flutter of concern. Michelle was on time by nature, her arrivals and departures as reliable as the town's church bells. By 8:45 p.m., Carol had tried calling the church office 3 times, getting only the answering machine. At 9 p.m., she called Patricia Simmons, who confirmed that Michelle had been at practice but couldn't remember seeing her leave. I remember Carol's voice on the phone. Patricia remembered in a 2015 interview. She was trying to stay calm, but there was this edge of panic starting to break through. She kept saying, "This isn't like Michelle. Something's wrong." And we all kept telling her that maybe Michelle had stopped somewhere, run into a friend, lost track of time. We were trying to reassure her, but we were reassuring ourselves too. David Lawrence left the house at 9:17 p.m., driving the familiar route to the church. The distance was only 2.3 miles, a journey that should have taken Michelle less than 7 minutes. He arrived at the church parking lot at 9:24 p.m. to find it empty except for one vehicle, Michelle's blue Honda, parked in its usual spot near the oak tree at the lot's eastern edge. The car was locked. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet inside containing her driver's license and $43 in cash. The hymnal she'd carried into the church was gone. There was no sign of struggle, no broken glass, no sign of anything wrong except for the obvious absence of Michelle herself. David Lawrence called the McCurtain County Sheriff's Department at 9:31 p.m. from the pay phone outside the church. Deputy Thomas Riley arrived 12 minutes later, followed shortly by Sheriff James Hartley. By 10:15 p.m., the church building had been unlocked and searched from basement to bell tower. Michelle was nowhere to be found. Pastor Gerald Matthews was reached at his home at 10:47 p.m. He arrived at the church at 11:03 p.m., still wearing his reading glasses and house slippers, looking like a man interrupted during a quiet evening at home. His wife Diane confirmed he'd been home since returning from the church around 7:45 p.m. after staying late to work on his sermon in his office. "I left right after the choir members did," Matthews told Sheriff Hartley in his first statement. "Michelle was gathering her things when I said goodnight. I assumed she left shortly after I did. She seemed fine, maybe a little tired, but nothing concerning." When asked whether Michelle had mentioned plans to meet anyone or go anywhere after practice, Matthews shook his head. "She didn't mention anything to me. We didn't really have much conversation today. She seemed preoccupied during practice." The statement matched what other choir members reported, and nothing in Matthews's behavior raised immediate suspicion. He was helpful, concerned, and offered to help with the search efforts in any way he could. He even suggested that the church board release emergency funds to support the investigation if needed. By midnight, Carol and David Lawrence were standing in their living room, surrounded by sheriff's deputies and concerned neighbors, trying to answer questions that had no answers. "When did you last see Michelle? What was she wearing? Did she have any problems with anyone? Could she have run away?" The questions felt absurd. Michelle didn't have problems. Michelle didn't run away. Michelle came home. Except this time, she hadn't. At 1:47 a.m., Sheriff Hartley made the decision to start a full missing persons investigation. At first light, the McCurtain County Volunteer Search and Rescue Team was activated. The church grounds and surrounding forest areas were named as the main search zone. Local radio stations were contacted to broadcast alerts when they started programming in the morning. Sunday, July 14th, dawned humid and cloudy. By 7 a.m., over 60 volunteers had gathered in the church parking lot, including Pastor Matthews, who had arrived carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing hiking boots. Search teams spread out in organized grids, covering the wooded areas behind the church, the residential neighborhoods, the shopping district, and the trails leading into the Ouachita National Forest. Bloodhound from state police tracked Michelle's scent from the church to the parking lot, then lost it, suggesting she had left the area in a vehicle. But whose vehicle? And why had she left her own car behind with her purse and keys inside? The search continued through Sunday afternoon and into Monday morning. Local television news crews arrived from Oklahoma City and Fort Smith, Arkansas. Michelle's photo appeared on the evening news, her senior yearbook picture filling screens across the region. The Lawrences sat for a tearful press conference, begging for information, for Michelle's safe return, for anything. "If someone has our daughter, please let her go," David Lawrence said, his voice breaking. "She's a good girl. She never hurt anyone. Just let her come home." Pastor Matthews stood slightly behind the family during the press conference, his hand resting supportively on Carol Lawrence's shoulder, his face showing pastoral concern. To everyone watching, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be, a spiritual leader supporting his people during an unthinkable crisis. By Tuesday, July 16th, 72 hours after Michelle's disappearance, the investigation had generated over 140 tips, but no solid leads. Her case was changed from a missing person to a suspected kidnapping. The FBI was contacted to provide additional resources. The search area expanded to a 50-mile zone, and somewhere in the Ouachita National Forest, beneath 6 feet of Oklahoma red clay and 30 years of built-up silence, Michelle Lawrence lay waiting to be found. The first investigation into Michelle Lawrence's disappearance was made harder by the very thing that defined Broken Bow, its closeness. In a town where everyone knew everyone, the idea that one of their own could be responsible for harming Michelle seemed impossible to believe. This group denial would prove to be the investigation's greatest obstacle. Lead investigator Detective Frank Bowen of the McCurtain County Sheriff's Department approached the case with careful precision. By July 20th, 1 week after Michelle's disappearance, he had made a list of 23 possible persons of interest. The list included every male who had been at or near the church that Saturday evening, plus anyone known to have had regular contact with Michelle. The first suspect was Michael Garrett, Michelle's ex-boyfriend from high school. They had dated for 7 months during their senior year before Michelle ended the relationship in February 1990. Garrett, now working at his father's auto repair shop, was interviewed 3 times. His alibi was solid. He'd been at a family barbecue in Idable with 17 witnesses, including his current girlfriend. Phone records confirmed he'd made calls from his parents' house throughout the evening. Reluctantly, investigators cleared him. The second focus was on fellow students from Southeastern Oklahoma State University. Detectives interviewed 42 classmates, library coworkers, and choir members. Each interview painted the same picture. Michelle was well-liked, kept to herself, had no known conflicts or romantic relationships. Her study partner, Jennifer Walsh, told investigators Michelle was focused on graduating and getting a teaching job. She didn't date, didn't party, didn't do anything that would give someone a reason to hurt her. By August 1991, Detective Bowen had removed all but 3 names from his suspect list. One was a drifter who had been seen near the church that weekend, but was later traced to Texas and cleared through credit card receipts. Another was a former church maintenance worker with a history of minor theft, but his location on July 13th was confirmed through work records at a construction site 30 miles away. The third name was Pastor Gerald Matthews, not as a main suspect, but as a witness who needed to be interviewed more carefully. Bowen's notes from August 12, 1991, show his thinking. Matthews was the last known person to see victim. Need to establish exact timeline of his movements after choir practice. Wife's alibi seems solid, but window of 7:30 to 7:45 p.m. unaccounted for. Matthews was interviewed again on August 15th at the sheriff's department, this time with his lawyer present, though he insisted he had nothing to hide. The interview lasted 93 minutes and was recorded on cassette tape, a recording that would be digitized and re-examined 3 decades later with fresh eyes and new understanding. I stayed in my office after everyone left, Matthews stated calmly. I was working on Sunday's sermon. I remember hearing cars leaving the parking lot probably around 7:25 or 7:30. I worked until about 7:40, then locked up and went home. I didn't see Michelle after the practice ended. When asked if Michelle had seemed troubled or mentioned any concerns, Matthews paused before responding. She'd been quieter than usual lately. I attributed it to stress from school. I'd offered to counsel her if she needed to talk, but she never took me up on it. Bowen pressed, "Did you have any private meetings with Michelle in the weeks before her disappearance?" "We met twice to discuss worship music selections," Matthews replied without hesitation. "Once in late June, once in early July. Both meetings lasted maybe 20 minutes. Nothing unusual." The answer was technically truthful, but incomplete. Matthews failed to mention the notes he'd left in Michelle's hymnal, the books he'd given her, or the nature of the conversations that had made Michelle uncomfortable enough to confide her concerns to her diary. Bowen requested permission to search Matthews' office at the church. Matthews agreed immediately, signing a consent form and personally walking investigators through the space. The office was neat, organized, dominated by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large oak desk. Detectives found sermon notes, church directories, religious texts, but nothing connecting Matthews to Michelle's disappearance. What they didn't find, because they didn't know to look for it, was Michelle's hymnal. Matthews had removed it from his office the night of her disappearance before burying it with her body in the forest. Without that piece of evidence, without the diary entries that wouldn't be fully analyzed until years later, investigators had no reason to view Matthews as anything other than a concerned pastor. By September 1991, the investigation had reached a dead end. Over 200 interviews had been conducted. Searches had covered 340 square miles of surrounding territory. The FBI's Behavior Analysis Unit had created a profile suggesting the person responsible was likely someone Michelle knew and trusted, possibly someone with authority over her. But the profile was too broad to be useful. "We're chasing ghosts," Detective Bowen wrote in his case summary dated September 30th, 1991. "Every lead dissolves under close examination. The physical evidence is limited to an abandoned vehicle with no signs of struggle. Without a body, without witnesses, without clear motive, we're operating blind." The case remained officially active, but with decreasing resources. New crimes demanded attention. Tips slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. By the first anniversary of Michelle's disappearance in July 1992, the investigation had been effectively put aside, though it was never formally closed. For Carol and David Lawrence, the stopping of active investigation felt like a second death. The not knowing was its own form of torture. Was Michelle alive somewhere, held captive, hoping for rescue? Or had she died that first night, her suffering mercifully brief? The uncertainty ate at them. Carol began her own investigation, creating a massive wall chart in the spare bedroom that tracked every tip, every timeline, every theory. She gave out flyers throughout Oklahoma and neighboring states, spending money the family couldn't afford on private investigators who ultimately found nothing new. She went to every cold case conference within driving distance, hoping to learn something that might help. David threw himself into work, taking double shifts at the mill, avoiding the house where Michelle's absence echoed in every room. He aged visibly, his hair turning white within a year, his shoulders permanently hunched as if carrying an invisible burden. On July 13th, 1995, for years to the day after Michelle vanished, Pastor Gerald Matthews led a memorial service at Broken Bow First Baptist Church. Over 300 people attended, filling the church to capacity. Matthews gave a sermon about faith in the face of unanswered questions, about trusting God's plan even when it made no sense. Carol Lawrence sat in the front pew, holding a framed photo of her daughter as Matthews spoke about Michelle's beautiful voice and pure spirit. She watched him lead the congregation in prayer, asking God to bring peace to Michelle's soul wherever she might be. She listened as he sang Amazing Grace, Michelle's favorite hymn, his voice steady and clear. And she never suspected that the man offering her spiritual comfort was the same man who had taken her daughter's life, who had looked into Michelle's terrified eyes as the light left them, who had buried her like garbage in the forest and returned to his comfortable life without missing a single night's sleep. The memorial service ended with the congregation joining hands and singing, "It is well with my soul." Matthew stood at the altar, tears streaming down his face, hands raised in worship. To everyone present, his grief appeared real, his compassion genuine, his ministry a blessing during unbearable times. It was a performance 30 years in the making, and it was perfect. The years following Michelle Lawrence's disappearance changed the landscape of Broken Bow in ways both visible and invisible. The town grew, businesses changed owners, new families arrived while others left. But beneath the surface of ordinary small-town life, Michelle's absence remained a wound that never fully healed, a mystery that defined an entire generation's understanding of their community's weakness. For Gerald Matthews, the years brought professional rise and public respect. In 1994, 3 years after Michelle's murder, the church board voted unanimously to make him senior pastor permanently, removing the temporary title he'd held since his predecessor's retirement. Under his leadership, Broken Bow First Baptist grew from a congregation of 180 to over 400 by the He remembered everyone's names, their children's birthdays, their struggles. He performed weddings and funerals with equal grace. People trusted him completely. Looking back now, knowing what we know, it makes my skin crawl. But at the time, he seemed like the embodiment of everything a pastor should be. Matthews's influence reached beyond the church walls. He was elected president of the Oklahoma Baptist Convention in 2002, a position that gave him statewide prominence. He served on the Broken Bow School Board from 1996 to 2004, championing music education programs with an irony that would later seem terrible. He counseled troubled teens, led countless weddings, and provided comfort to the dying and their families. Most disturbingly, Matthews kept up a relationship with the Lawrence family throughout these decades. He visited Carol and David occasionally, supposedly to check on their spiritual well-being and offer continued prayers for Michelle's case. He sent cards on Michelle's birthday each year, simple notes expressing hope for resolution and peace. He came to our house in 1998 when David was diagnosed with cancer. Carol Lawrence told Detective Amanda Reeves in 2021 after Matthews' arrest. He sat in our living room and prayed with us. He held my husband's hands and asked God to give us strength. And the whole time he knew where Michelle was. He knew what he'd done. The level of evil required to look a grieving mother in the eye year after year while carrying that secret. I have no words for it. David Lawrence died in April 2003, 12 years after his daughter's disappearance, having never learned her fate. His obituary noted that he was preceded in death by his beloved daughter Michelle, whose memory he carried until his last breath. Matthews led the funeral, giving a eulogy that praised David's unwavering faith and strength. For Carol, being a widow added another layer to her lonely watch. She continued living in the house on Cedar Street, now surrounded by photos of the daughter and husband she'd lost. Michelle's bedroom remained exactly as it had been in July 1991, a shrine to a life interrupted. The diary, along with other personal belongings, had been returned to Carol after the first investigation yielded no breaks. She read and reread those pages, searching for clues that investigators had missed. The case itself went through occasional reviews as science technology advanced and new detectives inherited the files. In 1998, the original evidence was re-examined using updated fingerprint analysis techniques. Nothing new came up. In 2005, Detective Maria Santos conducted a complete cold case review, re-interviewing surviving witnesses and searching for inconsistencies in original statements. Her report concluded, all investigative paths appear to have been thoroughly explored. Without new evidence or witnesses, this case remains unsolvable with current resources. The 20th anniversary of Michelle's disappearance in July 2011 brought renewed media attention. The Oklahoma newspaper published a long-form feature titled The Girl Who Vanished, 2 Decades Without Answers. The article included interviews with Carol Lawrence, former investigators, and Pastor Matthews, who was quoted expressing continued heartbreak over the unsolved case. Not a day goes by that I don't think about Michelle, Matthews told the reporter, standing in front of the church where he'd last seen her alive. I pray for her soul, and I pray that her family might someday find peace. This community has carried this burden for 20 years. We all want resolution. The article generated tips, but none led anywhere useful. The case faded once again into the background of community consciousness, occasionally remembered, but increasingly regarded as a tragedy that would never be solved. The breakthrough began not with dramatic discoveries, but with administrative changes in law enforcement technology and staffing. In 2018, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation received federal funding to establish a dedicated cold case unit staffed by 4 investigators and equipped with access to cutting-edge science resources. Detective Amanda Reeves, then 31 years old with 7 years of experience in major crimes, was assigned to lead the unit. Reeves brought a fresh perspective shaped by modern investigative techniques. She had completed special training in genetic family tree research, digital evidence analysis, and psychological profiling of long-term offenders. When she received the Michelle Lawrence case file in January 2019, it consisted of 14 boxes of documents, photos, evidence logs, and recorded interviews spanning 3 decades. I spent 2 months just reading, Reeves later explained. I read every interview transcript, every witness statement, every tip that had been called in. I read Michelle's diary probably 20 times, and I kept coming back to one name that appeared throughout the file but had never been seriously investigated, Gerald Matthews. What caught Reeves's attention wasn't any single piece of evidence, but rather a pattern of small inconsistencies and omissions. Matthews claimed he'd left the church around 7:40 p.m. on July 13th, but his wife's statement said he arrived home around 7:45 or maybe a little later. The difference was minor, but it opened a window of time that had never been fully accounted for. Matthews said he and Michelle had met twice to discuss worship music, but Michelle's diary mentioned at least 4 private meetings, plus the notes left in her hymnal. Why would Matthews minimize their contact? Michelle's final diary entries expressed discomfort with Matthews' attention. Yet this had been dismissed in the original investigation as typical teenage overthinking. Reeves began building what she called a behavioral timeline of Matthews' interactions with Michelle in the 6 months before her disappearance. She interviewed former church members who had since moved away, people who hadn't been available during the original investigation. 3 women, now in their 50s, came forward with stories that had disturbing similarities to Michelle's experience. Rebecca Walsh had been 17 in 1987 when Matthews counseled her after her parents' divorce. He was very intense about my spiritual well-being, she told Reeves during a phone interview from her home in Dallas. He insisted on private meetings, gave me books, told me I was special. I felt uncomfortable, but thought maybe that's just how youth counseling worked. My mom pulled me out of the church because she didn't like how much time Pastor Matthews wanted to spend alone with me. Jennifer Morrison reported similar experiences from 1993. He had a pattern. Young women in the church who sang or had musical talent. He'd single them out for mentoring. It always started innocently, but it would get progressively more intense, more personal. I finally told my parents, and we switched churches. A third woman who asked to remain anonymous described meetings in 1996 that escalated to Matthews touching her hand during prayer, making comments about her appearance, suggesting they had a special spiritual connection. When she resisted, Matthews backed off immediately and became cold toward her, eventually suggesting she might be more comfortable at another congregation. The pattern was clear. Matthews had a history of inappropriate behavior with young women, particularly those involved in church music. He was calculated enough to stop before crossing legal lines, manipulative enough to frame his behavior as spiritual concern, and strategic enough to target individuals unlikely to be believed if they reported him. In March 2020, Reeves requested funding to conduct a complete property search related to Matthews. Her proposal noted that Matthews had kept a hunting lease in the Ouachita National Forest since 1967, a detail buried in financial records but never investigated. The lease was located 1.8 miles from where the original search for Michelle had been conducted in 1991. The funding was approved, but putting it into action was delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic. It wasn't until August 2020 that Reeves could arrange for cadaver dogs to search the leased property. The dogs, trained to detect human remains, even decades old, alerted to a specific area about 200 yards from the abandoned hunting cabin. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the dogs' findings, oddities in the soil consistent with a burial site. But getting a search warrant required more than suspicion. Reeves needed probable cause, and after 30 years, that seemed impossible to establish. The break came from an unexpected source. In June 2021, a woman named Patricia Harris contacted the OSBI tip line. She had been cleaning out her late mother's attic and found a box of letters from the 1990s. Her mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had been the church pianist who gave Michelle free piano lessons as a child. Among the letters was one dated August 1991, written by Michelle and apparently never mailed. The letter began, "Dear Mrs. Whitfield, I need to tell someone what's been happening with Pastor Matthews. I'm scared to tell my parents because I don't want to cause problems at church, but his attention toward me has become frightening." The letter went on to describe Matthews' escalating behavior in clear detail. The inappropriate comments, the unwanted touching disguised as prayer, the suggestions that Michelle was special to him in ways that went beyond normal pastoral care. Most importantly, it mentioned a confrontation Michelle planned to have with Matthews after choir practice on July 13th. "I'm going to tell him clearly that I'm uncomfortable and that these private meetings need to stop," Michelle had written. "If he doesn't respect that, I'll have to tell my parents or maybe even the police. I don't want to ruin his reputation, but I can't keep pretending this is normal." The letter had apparently been given to Mrs. Whitfield for advice, but was never sent. Eleanor had passed away in 2019 without mentioning it, and her daughter only discovered it 2 years later while sorting through decades of stored correspondence. Armed with the letter, Michelle's diary entries, the pattern of behavior with other young women, and the cadaver dog alerts, Reeves obtained a search warrant. The digging began on September 13, 2021, exactly 30 years and 2 months after Michelle's disappearance. When the remains were uncovered along with Michelle's church hymnal, Reeves knew the evidence would finally speak louder than decades of silence. DNA confirmation would take several days, but the presence of the hymnal with Michelle's name written inside left little doubt. On September 13, 2021, at 6:47 p.m., Reeves stood on Gerald Matthews' porch with an arrest warrant. The man who had hidden behind a collar and a cross for 3 decades would finally face earthly justice, though no sentence could restore the years stolen from Michelle Lawrence or return peace to the mother who had never stopped searching. The interrogation room at the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Oklahoma City was purposely plain. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, a metal table bolted to the floor, and 2 chairs facing each other across an unbridgeable divide. On one side sat Detective Amanda Reeves, a digital recorder between them documenting every word. On the other sat Gerald Matthews, 78 years old, his hands folded calmly on the table as if preparing to give a benediction. It was September 14, 2021, 18 hours after his arrest. Matthews had been read his Miranda rights, had talked with his lawyer, and had been advised to say nothing. Yet he spoke anyway, pushed by something Reeves couldn't quite identify. Not remorse exactly, perhaps exhaustion from carrying a secret that had grown heavier with each passing year. "I'd like to make a statement," Matthews said, his pastoral voice steady despite the circumstances. His attorney, Thomas Carrion, placed a hand on his client's arm in warning, but Matthews gently removed it. "No, Tom, it's time. Past time." What followed was a 47-minute confession that would be written down, analyzed, and ultimately presented as the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Matthews spoke with the same measured pace he'd used in thousands of sermons, but the words were a liturgy of manipulation, violence, and calculated deception. "Michelle was special," he began, using the same word that had appeared in his notes to her, in his conversations about her, in his public statements after her disappearance. "Extraordinarily talented, pure in a way that's rare. I told myself I was mentoring her, helping her reach her potential, but I was lying to myself. The attention I gave her wasn't pastoral. It was personal, possessive." He described the escalation of his fixation with clinical detachment, as if discussing someone else's sins, the private meetings that grew longer and more frequent, the gifts of books with inscriptions that crossed professional boundaries, the physical contact, brief touches that he justified as spiritual connection. "She began pulling away in early July," Matthews continued. "She stopped making eye contact. She found excuses to avoid being alone with me. I knew she was going to confront me. I could see it building, and I couldn't allow that. My reputation, my ministry, my family, everything would have been destroyed by her accusations." On July 13th, after choir practice ended and the other members had left, Matthews had asked Michelle to stay for a brief meeting in his office. She had agreed, reluctantly, bringing her hymnal with her, perhaps as a symbol of the sacred space that should have protected her. "I told her we needed to clear the air," Matthews said, his voice dropping slightly. "I said I sensed she was uncomfortable, and I wanted to apologize if I'd made her feel that way. She was relieved at first, thought I was going to back off. But then I asked her not to say anything to anyone. I said it would hurt the church, hurt her family's standing in the community, hurt her own reputation. I tried to convince her that silence was the Christian thing to do." Michelle had refused. According to Matthews' account, she told him clearly that what he'd done was wrong, that she intended to tell her parents, and that if he approached her inappropriately again, she would report him to church leadership and possibly the police. "She stood up to leave," Matthews said, staring at his hands. "And I panicked. I grabbed her arm to stop her. She pulled away hard, and I pushed her. She fell backward, and her head struck the corner of my desk. The sound was, he paused, the first crack appearing in his composure. I can still hear it 30 years later. I hear it every night before I sleep. Medical examiner reports would later confirm that Michelle died from blunt force trauma to the back of her skull, consistent with falling backward onto a hard edge. The injury would have caused immediate unconsciousness and death within minutes. But Matthews's response to that injury revealed the true nature of his character. I checked for a pulse, and there wasn't one, he continued. I should have called for help immediately. Even if she was already gone, I should have called 911, told the truth, faced the consequences. But all I could think about was my life, my career, my family, everything I'd built. So I made a choice. The choice was to hide Michelle's body and construct a narrative that would turn away suspicion. Matthews wrapped her in a tarpaulin he kept in his office closet, originally purchased for protecting furniture during building renovations. He placed her body in the trunk of his car, covering it with boxes of church supplies. He then returned to the church office, cleaned the area where Michelle had fallen, and carefully arranged the scene to appear undisturbed. He drove home at his usual time, had dinner with his wife, and waited until she went to bed around 10:30 p.m. Diane Matthews regularly took sleep medication for chronic insomnia, a detail her husband knew and used. Once she was asleep, he drove the 32 miles to his hunting lease in the Ouachita National Forest, arriving around 11:45 p.m. The ground was soft from recent rain, Matthews recalled. I brought a shovel from my garage. It took me almost 3 hours to dig deep enough. I put Michelle in the ground, still wrapped in the tarp, and I buried her hymnal with her. I don't know why. Perhaps some twisted sense that she should have something familiar with her. Or perhaps I was trying to dispose of evidence. Even now, I'm not sure of my own motives. He returned home at 3:20 a.m., showered, burned the clothes he'd been wearing in his fireplace, and went to bed. When the search began the next day, Matthews participated actively, projecting concern while knowing exactly where Michelle lay. I told myself that time would make it easier, he said, that eventually the guilt would fade, that I could compartmentalize it and move forward. But it never faded. Every sermon I preached, every prayer I led, every person I counseled, I was living a lie. And yet I couldn't bring myself to confess. The longer I waited, the more impossible confession became. So I just continued, year after year after year. When Reeves asked why he kept the hunting lease for decades despite claiming he no longer hunted, Matthews's answer was chilling in its honesty. I couldn't risk someone else leasing that land, couldn't risk them discovering what I'd buried there. So I paid the fees every year, never visited, just kept paying to make sure that piece of earth remained undisturbed. The formal charges were filed on September 16, 2021. First-degree murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Matthews was denied bail given his age and flight risk. The arraignment drew national media attention, transforming a small-town tragedy into a cautionary tale about trusted authority figures and institutional failure. Carol Lawrence learned of Matthews's arrest from Detective Reeves, who made the notification in person at the Cedar Street house where Carol had lived for 53 years. The news that Michelle had been found, that her killer had been identified, that justice was finally possible, it should have brought relief. Instead, Carol's reaction was more complex. I should feel victorious, she told a local reporter 2 days later. But all I feel is tired and old and angry about all the wasted years. Gerald Matthews stole my daughter. Then he stole 30 years of truth. He stood in my living room and prayed with me while knowing he'd killed my child. That kind of cruelty goes beyond anything I have words for. The trial was scheduled for March 2022, but in February, Matthews' attorney negotiated a plea agreement. Matthews would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for prosecutors dropping the additional charges and recommending a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Given Matthews' age and health conditions, including early-stage Parkinson's disease and cardiac issues, everyone understood this was effectively a death sentence. The plea hearing on February 28, 2022, was brief but emotionally charged. Matthews, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his smaller frame, stood before Judge Rebecca Morrison and formally entered his guilty plea. Judge Morrison allowed victim impact statements before sentencing. Carol Lawrence, now 74 and visibly frail, approached the microphone with a written statement she'd spent weeks writing. Gerald Matthews took my daughter from me on July 13, 1991, she read, her voice wavering but determined. But his cruelty didn't end there. For 30 years, he performed a grotesque pantomime of compassion. He came to my home. He prayed with my dying husband. He sent cards on Michelle's birthday. He looked me in the eye year after year, while hiding the truth about what he'd done. She paused, gripping the podium for support. I'm 74 years old. I've spent more than half my life grieving a daughter whose fate I didn't know. Michelle would be 50 years old now. She wanted to be a music teacher. She wanted to help children find their voices. Instead, hers was silenced by a man who claimed to serve God while serving only himself. Carol looked directly at Matthews for the first time. I don't forgive you. I won't pretend that forgiveness is healing or noble in this case. What you did was unforgivable. I hope you live long enough in prison to fully understand how big the destruction you caused was. And I hope that every night you hear the sound of my daughter's head hitting your desk, may it haunt you until your last breath. Matthew showed no visible reaction to her words, staring straight ahead with the same emotionless expression he'd kept throughout the proceedings. Judge Morrison sentenced Matthews to life imprisonment without possibility of parole at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He was taken into custody immediately, transported from the courthouse in handcuffs while a crowd of onlookers shouted condemnations and a few remaining supporters wept in disbelief. The case's resolution sent shock waves through Broken Bow and the wider religious community. Broken Bow First Baptist Church issued a statement expressing horror at the revelations and offering support to the Lawrence family and any other potential victims of Matthews' manipulation. The church board voted unanimously to remove Matthews' name from all plaques, awards, and memorial dedications. The sanctuary he'd helped build was rededicated without his name attached to it. Several other women came forward after Matthews' arrest, describing similar patterns of inappropriate behavior during his decades of ministry. While none of these incidents rose to the level of criminal charges, they painted a picture of a predator who had operated with freedom for years, protected by his position and the community's unwillingness to believe a pastor could be capable of such things. Michelle's remains were finally laid to rest on March 15, 2022, in a small ceremony at Broken Bow Memorial Cemetery. She was buried beside her father. The two reunited after decades of separation. Carol Lawrence, supported by extended family and a few close friends, placed Michelle's high school graduation photo on the casket before it was lowered into the ground. She's finally home, Carol said simply. It's not the homecoming I prayed for 30 years ago, but at least now I know. At least now she can rest. The investigation's success led to renewed interest in cold cases across Oklahoma and beyond. Detective Reeves became a sought-after expert on genetic family tree research and behavioral pattern analysis in long-dormant cases. The techniques used to solve Michelle's murder were incorporated into training programs nationwide. Gerald Matthews died on November 3, 2023, 19 months after his imprisonment, from complications related to pneumonia and heart failure. He was 79 years old. His death was noted briefly in local newspapers, but generated little public interest. The man who had once commanded the respect of thousands died, largely unmourned. His legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the masks people wear and the secrets they keep. Carol Lawrence outlived her daughter's killer by 6 months. She passed away peacefully on May 17, 2024, at 76 years old. Her obituary noted that she was reunited with her beloved daughter Michelle and husband David. Among her personal belongings was a worn leather journal containing 33 years of handwritten entries, one for each year since Michelle's disappearance. The final entry, dated 3 days before her death, read simply, "I kept my promise. I never stopped looking. Michelle is found. I can rest now." The house on Cedar Street was sold to a young family who knew nothing of its history. Michelle's bedroom, preserved for 3 decades as a shrine, was repainted and converted into a nursery. The new owners planted flowers in the front yard, unaware that the previous occupant had tended those same beds while carrying grief that would have crushed most people. In the Ouachita National Forest, the site where Michelle's body lay hidden for 30 years has been reclaimed by nature. The hunting lease was ended, and the land returned to full federal control. No marker shows what happened there, but the forest remembers. The trees that provided cover for an unspeakable crime now stand as silent witnesses to truth finally revealed. Justice for Michelle Lawrence came decades too late to return lost years or heal broken hearts. But it came. And in a world where so many voices are silenced forever, where so many crimes remain unsolved and unpunished, that matters. It matters that the earth finally gave up its secret. It matters that science and persistence overcame time and deception. It matters that a young woman's life, cut short by violence and hidden by lies, was finally acknowledged, mourned, and remembered, not just as a mystery, but as a person who deserved better than she received. The cold case was closed. The file, now complete with confession and conviction, was archived. But Michelle Lawrence's story continues. A reminder that some silences are meant to be broken, some secrets are meant to be revealed, and justice, however delayed, remains worth pursuing until the very